There is a photograph taken in the city of Basra in the spring of 2003 that most people have never seen. It shows a young British soldier, no older than 19 or 20, sitting on the front of an armored vehicle in the afternoon heat, his helmet off, his rifle resting across his knees. Across from him, barely 2 feet away, sits an elderly Iraqi man with a white beard and a clay cup of tea in his hands. They are talking. Nobody is shouting. Nobody is afraid. 2 weeks earlier, that same street had been a battlefield.
An American colonel who passed that scene wrote about it in a letter home. He said he had seen many things in his career that surprised him, but that moment, a British soldier and an Iraqi elder sharing tea in the ruins of a war, was not something he had been trained to expect. This is the story of Operation Telic, Britain's part in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and it is the story of what the most senior military commanders in the United States said when they watched 46,000 British men and women fight one of the most complex battles of the entire campaign, and then, within the same afternoon, put down their weapons and become something else entirely. By the winter of 2002, it was clear that the war was coming. American planners at Central Command had spent months drawing maps and writing orders, and when those maps were finally spread across the planning tables, a problem became obvious. The south of Iraq, the entire bottom third of the country, including its second-largest city, its oil infrastructure, and more than 4 million civilians, needed to be taken and held at the same time as the main American drive north toward Baghdad. The two objectives could not wait for each other. They had to happen simultaneously.
The Americans asked the British to take the South. It was not a simple request. Basra alone, Iraq's second city, sat behind layers of regular army soldiers, irregular Fedayeen fighters loyal to Saddam personally, and armed Ba'ath Party militias that had spent decades terrorizing the population and had no intention of surrendering without a fight. Intelligence reports warned that chemical weapons might be pre-positioned in the area. The oil pipelines and pumping stations on the Al-Faw Peninsula, which handled roughly 80% of Iraq's entire oil export capacity, were believed to be wired for destruction, the same way Saddam had burned Kuwait's oil fields during his retreat in 1991. The numbers told their own story. Major General Robin Brims commanded the British 1st Armored Division, responsible for an operational area of roughly 15,000 square kilometers. His ground combat strength was approximately 26,000 soldiers. Against them, Iraqi forces in the south numbered somewhere around 17,000 regular troops, plus an unknown additional quantity of Fedayeen and militia. The British were, in places, outnumbered in their own area of operations, and they would be doing all of this while wearing full nuclear, biological, and chemical protection suits, heavy layers of rubber and charcoal, in temperatures that would reach over 40 degrees Celsius before the campaign was 3 weeks old. At Central Command headquarters in Qatar, General Tommy Franks and his staff watched the British preparations with a mixture of respect and private anxiety. The relationship between the two militaries went back generations through Normandy, Korea, and the Gulf War of 1991. But this was the largest joint operation in more than 50 years, and the British were being handed one of its most delicate problems. The quiet question that lingered in those corridors, the one nobody put into an official briefing, was simple. Could they really do this? On the evening of the 19th of March, 2003, at a dusty staging camp in the Kuwaiti desert, a few miles from the Iraqi border, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Collins gathered the 800 soldiers of the 1st Battalion Royal Irish Regiment in the fading light and spoke to them for perhaps 10 minutes. There was no microphone, no stage. The men simply gathered around their commanding officer in the open desert and listened. Collins told them they were going into Iraq to liberate a people, not to conquer a country. He told them to be ferocious in battle and generous in victory. He reminded them,
And this was the part that many of those soldiers would carry for the rest of their lives, that the enemy soldiers they were about to face had woken up that morning as ordinary men, fathers and brothers and sons, not planning to die, and that even in death they deserved to be treated with dignity. A journalist embedded with the unit recorded the speech and filed it. Within days it had been published across the world. A copy reached the White House, where, according to journalists covering the administration at the time, President George W. Bush had it printed and pinned to the wall of the Oval Office. It was the first signal, before a single shot had been fired, that the British were bringing something to this war that went beyond tanks and artillery. Collins himself would say later that he had simply tried to tell his men the truth. That was all.
In the hours after that speech, those 800 soldiers sat in the desert and wrote letters home. They checked their weapons and loaded their ammunition and said things on paper that they had never been able to say out loud. Most of them had served in Northern Ireland or the Balkans. They knew danger, but very few had ever fought a full conventional war, a war with tanks and artillery and a national army on the other side. For the young soldiers sitting in the Kuwaiti dust that night, this would be the test of their lives. The assault began in darkness and in chaos. On the night of the 20th of March, Royal Marines from 4-2 Commando and 4-0 Commando launched from helicopters and landing craft toward the Al-Faw Peninsula, tasked with seizing the oil infrastructure before Saddam's forces could destroy it. The plan called for speed and surprise. What it encountered was a sandstorm. The storm had been building all day and hit with its full force just hours before the attack. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Sand tore at exposed skin and forced its way into every gap in clothing and equipment. American helicopters assigned to support the operation were grounded. Their commanders judged the conditions too dangerous to fly. The British pilots from 845 Naval Air Squadron, flying Sea Kings, and 847 Naval Air Squadron, flying Lynx, made a different decision. They climbed into their aircraft and flew directly into the storm, navigating by instruments alone, delivering Marines onto landing zones they could not see.
The men hit the ground and immediately came under fire. Not from the regular Iraqi army, which was already beginning to fragment, but from Fedayeen fighters and Ba'ath Party loyalists dug into buildings, bunkers, and palm groves. The fighting was close and dirty. Royal Marines pushed through mud and date palms wearing full chemical protection suits, sweating through every layer, engaging targets at short range with rifles and machine guns and anti-tank missiles. Mortar rounds thumped into the soft ground around them. In the middle of all of this, the Special Boat Service carried out a separate classified mission to secure the main oil pumping stations before they could be blown. They succeeded. That single operation, conducted in the dark by a small number of men against defended positions, saved billions of dollars in infrastructure and prevented an environmental catastrophe that could have poisoned the Persian Gulf for a generation. It received almost no coverage in the press at the time. It still receives very little today. Basra sat behind its defenses and waited. For 2 weeks after the initial landings, British forces surrounded the city without assaulting it directly. Challenger 2 tanks and Warrior fighting vehicles from the 7th Armored Brigade, the Desert Rats, whose lineage ran back to the North African campaign of the Second World War, formed a cordon around the outer edges, while smaller teams pushed inside on raids and reconnaissance patrols, probing the defenses, gathering intelligence, and slowly tightening the pressure.
It was not a popular strategy in every quarter. The American advance toward Baghdad had run into serious problems with Fedayeen attacks on extended supply lines, and some voices in the American press began asking whether the British were being too cautious, too careful, whether they had lost their nerve. The soldiers, sitting in their vehicles in the desert heat, taking mortar fire and running night patrols through the city's edges, had no access to those television programs. They were doing their jobs, and their commanders understood something that the television analysts did not, that Basra was not simply a military target to be destroyed. It was a city of 1.3 million people, and when the fighting stopped, those people would still be there, and the British would have to live among them. The intelligence was building. Inside the city, something was shifting. Civilians were beginning to resist the Ba'ath Party, throwing rocks at officials, attacking militia checkpoints in small groups. The population that had lived under that terror for decades was ready. On the morning of the 6th of April, Major General Brims gave the order to go in.
The assault was fast, deliberate, and violent. Artillery and RAF Tornado jets struck known enemy positions in the opening minutes. Then the armor moved. Challenger 2s from the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards and the Queen's Royal Lancers pushing into the western suburbs through streets barely wide enough to accommodate them. Rocket-propelled grenades flashing against their armor from windows and alleyways, while infantry from the Black Watch, the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, and the Blues and Royals poured out of warrior vehicles behind them to clear the buildings room by room. The temperature was above 35 degrees. British soldiers fought in soaking uniforms, kicking in doors in the narrow streets of a foreign city, while the sounds of the battle echoed off the walls around them. Brigadier Graham Binns, commanding the 7th Brigade from a warrior near the front of the advance, made a decision that would be studied in military academies for years afterward. Instead of securing each block before moving to the next, the textbook approach, he pushed his armored columns straight for the symbolic heart of the city, the Ba'ath Party headquarters and the centers of power that the regime had used to control the population for 30 years. The speed of the move caught the Iraqi defense completely off balance. Pockets of fighters were bypassed and left for follow-on infantry. The momentum never stopped. By the afternoon of the 6th of April, the Iraqi defense did not weaken gradually, it collapsed. Ba'ath officials fled in civilian vehicles. Regular soldiers stripped off their uniforms and disappeared into the crowds. By the 7th of April, Basra was in British hands, the largest city taken by British forces since the Second World War, captured in roughly 36 hours of direct assault after 2 weeks of patient preparation. The reaction from American commanders was immediate. General Tommy Franks described the British operation as a textbook example of how to take a city. He later wrote that Major General Brims had shown what he called operational patience combined with tactical aggression, a combination that most armies struggled to achieve. Lieutenant General James Conway, whose Marines operated directly alongside the British in the south, told colleagues that watching the British handle Basra had convinced him they were among the finest soldiers in the world at that particular kind of warfare, the kind where the mission changed from hour to hour, where a soldier might be in a firefight at 9 in the morning and negotiating with a tribal elder at noon. Major General James Mattis, the Marine commander who would later become one of America's most respected military leaders and eventually Secretary of Defense, told colleagues that the British had demonstrated something in Basra that deserved serious study: the discipline to win without destroying what you were trying to save. At a forward operating base near the city, an American colonel watched a platoon of Royal Marines return from a firefight, clean their weapons, swap their helmets for berets, and walk into a nearby village to distribute water and speak with local families, all within 30 minutes of the last shot being fired. He turned to a British officer standing beside him and asked the question that had been forming in the minds of American commanders for weeks. How do they do that? The answer was not a secret. It had been learned over decades in places most Americans had never heard of: Malaya in the 1950s, Borneo in the 1960s, Aden, Northern Ireland, the Balkans. Small, brutal, complicated conflicts where the enemy wore no uniform and the civilian population was both the objective and the obstacle, and where the use of overwhelming force created more enemies than it eliminated. The British Army had spent half a century learning, at considerable cost, that you cannot shoot your way to a lasting peace. By 2003, that lesson was built into their training, their doctrine, and their instincts. Behind the strategy and the statistics and the praise from foreign generals, this war was fought by real people with real names, and their stories deserve to be told plainly. Sergeant Stephen Roberts of the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment was 28 years old. He had grown up in Bradford, joined the Army as a young man, and by the spring of 2003 was a well-regarded soldier with years of experience. On the 24th of March, near the town of Az-Zubair, he was shot and killed. The reason his death became a national scandal had nothing to do with the circumstances of the fighting. Stephen Roberts had been forced to give his enhanced body armor to another soldier before the invasion because the British government had not bought enough sets for everyone who needed one. He was wearing the older, thinner protection when the bullet struck him. His widow, Samantha Roberts, spent years fighting for a public explanation and for better equipment for the soldiers still serving. The shortages she exposed were not a secret inside the Army. Officers and soldiers had known about them for months before the invasion. The secret had simply been kept from the public.
Staff Sergeant Simon Cullingworth and Sapper Luke Alsop of 33 Engineer Regiment were captured near Az-Zubair on the 23rd of March after taking a wrong turn. Their bodies were found days later. They had been executed. The news spread through the ranks quietly, the way that kind of news always does, and the men who had known them, who had shared rooms with them back on barracks, who had eaten meals with them in Kuwait the week before, carried it with them for the rest of the campaign and long afterward. Corporal of Horse Matty Hull of the Blues and Royals died on the 28th of March when his light reconnaissance vehicle was attacked by an American A-10 ground attack aircraft. A mistake, not a crime, but the word mistake carries very little weight when you are the one writing the letter to a man's family. The cockpit audio from the American aircraft was later leaked to the press. On it, the pilot could be heard realizing what he had done. The recording became a source of deep and lasting anger in Britain, and the family's long fight for answers strained the relationship between the two Allied governments for years.
Private Johnson Bahari had been born on the Caribbean island of Grenada and had come to England as a young man. He joined the Army and became a driver of a warrior fighting vehicle with the 1st Battalion, Princess of Wales's Royal Regiment. On the 1st of May 2004, more than a year after the fall of Basra during the occupation that followed, his unit drove into an ambush in the city of Al-Amara. A rocket-propelled grenade destroyed the vehicle's communications and wounded the commander in the turret. With no orders and no radio, Bahari drove the warrior through the ambush, ramming through enemy barricades while rounds hammered the vehicle from every direction and got his crew to safety. 6 weeks later, it happened again. Another ambush, another RPG, this one detonating close enough to his head that a fragment lodged in his brain. He was blinded and barely conscious, but he reversed the vehicle out of the kill zone and saved every man in it before collapsing. He spent months in a coma. He had to learn to walk again and to speak again and to recognize the faces of the people he loved. When he recovered, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor in Britain, the first living recipient in nearly 40 years. The guns fell quiet in Basra, but the city did not fall quiet. Within hours of the last resistance collapsing, thousands of civilians poured into the streets. Some cheered, some wept.
Many surged toward the government buildings and Ba'ath Party offices that had controlled their lives for decades and began tearing them apart with their bare hands, pulling portraits from walls, dragging furniture into the streets. British soldiers stood on those street corners and watched and tried to understand where the line was between a people reclaiming their city and a city destroying itself. They were exhausted from weeks of combat in brutal heat, and now they were being asked to become something entirely different. Police officers, aid workers, diplomats, all at the same time, in a place they had only just stopped fighting through. British commanders made a deliberate decision in those first days after the fighting. Once the situation was stable enough, they ordered their soldiers to remove their helmets and put on their soft berets. It was a calculated signal. We are not here to occupy you. We are here to help. And it carried a real risk. Looking approachable could get you killed, but looking like an invader would lose you the peace. The image of British troops patrolling Basra in berets became one of the most reproduced photographs of the entire war.
For a period in the spring of 2003, it seemed to be working. Shia families who had suffered the worst of Saddam's rule threw flowers and offered tea. There were moments, genuine, unrepeatable moments that felt like something other than the aftermath of a war. Those moments did not last. By 2006, Shia militias backed by Iranian money and weapons had grown powerful enough to control entire neighborhoods of the city. British forces, stretched too thin and given too few resources by a government that had already shifted its attention to Afghanistan, found themselves losing ground steadily. In 2007, British forces withdrew from their base at Basra Palace in a negotiated arrangement with local militias, an arrangement that many serving officers described, with considerable bitterness, as a managed retreat. The following year, Iraqi forces backed by American advisors launched Operation Charge of the Knights to retake the city. Some of the same American officers who had praised the British performance in 2003 said quietly, in private, that the occupation phase had not gone well. It was a painful admission, and an honest one.
In total, 179 British service personnel died in Iraq between 2003 and 2011. Over 2,000 more came home with wounds, some visible, some the kind that do not show up on any scan, the kind that announce themselves at 3 in the morning when the house is quiet. The Chilcot inquiry, the British government's own 7-year investigation into the decision to go to war, concluded that the invasion had taken place before peaceful options were exhausted, that the intelligence about weapons of mass destruction had been wrong, and that the planning for what would happen after the fighting was wholly inadequate. It found that soldiers had been sent into combat without sufficient equipment and without a credible plan for the morning after. It found, in careful official language, that the government had failed the people it sent to war. The same report acknowledged that the men and women of the British armed forces had served with courage and distinction. The politicians had failed. The soldiers had not.
The lessons the British taught the Americans about urban warfare did not disappear with the occupation. General David Petraeus, who wrote the United States Army's Counterinsurgency Manual in 2006, the manual that shaped American strategy for the remainder of the Iraq War and then Afghanistan, acknowledged British experience as a significant influence. James Mattis carried what he had observed in southern Iraq into Marine Corps training and doctrine. Methods forged in campaigns that most Americans had never heard of turned out to matter enormously in the kind of war the 21st century kept producing. At the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire, England, a wall of stone stands among the trees. Carved into it are 179 names. Families come throughout the year, on anniversaries, on birthdays, on ordinary days when the weight of it simply becomes too much to carry alone. They leave flowers, Sometimes they leave handwritten notes, folded against the stone. In Basra itself, the memories are complicated. The liberation of April 2003 was real. The joy in those streets on that first day was genuine, and the people who felt it have not forgotten it. But the years that followed brought violence and disappointment that is also real, and also has not been forgotten. The British soldiers who served there tend to speak about it carefully, in the way that people speak about things they are still trying to make sense of.
One Royal Marine who had flown into the sandstorm over Al-Faw on the very first night of the war was interviewed some years later. He had served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He thought about the question for a moment, and then he said something quietly. "We did what we were asked to do. We did it as well as we could." 179 names on a wall in Staffordshire. Flowers left against cold stone, and the people who placed them there, standing in the quiet among the trees, still trying to answer the question that nobody who was not there has any right to answer for them.
If you were there, if you served in Iraq in any capacity, in any unit, or if you knew someone who did, we would genuinely like to hear from you in the comments. Not to argue about politics or strategy, just to hear what it was actually like. The history books can tell us what happened. Only the people who were there can tell us what it felt like. If stories like this matter to you, the human side of these events, told as plainly and honestly as we can manage, then subscribe. There are more of them to tell.